Welcome dear students. In today's session we are going to discuss about decision making under uncertainty, which is the first topic of our master degree syllabus of economics in Assam Women's University. We have 3 core courses in each semesters, and this is the first core course that you will attempt, for which you will need just a clear understanding of the graduation syllabus, BA syllabus of economics. That's it, and we can start. The first topic is that decision making under certainty. When it comes to our mind, few questions comes to our mind along with this, that why do we need to make choices? Because in economics we have always learned that we have limited resources and we have scarce resources and unlimited ones. So to maximize our utility, to maximize our satisfaction, and to have a sound utilization of the resources, we have to make certain choices, and in these choices we have to make some combinations of goods and services so that the utilities gets maximized. With this, the first part of the decision making under certainty starts with the indifference curve analysis of Hicks and Allen. Okay, so while discussing indifference curve analysis, we have to keep certain things in mind. The assumptions of the indifference curve analysis, those are: number 1, we assume the consumer to be a rational consumer. Okay. Second is that we assume the utility to be in a ordinal scale. So while discussing this, we have to remember that what do we mean by rational consumer? A rational consumer is that one who wants to maximize his utility, whatever the choices he have to make. And second, regarding the ordinal utility, we have to clearly understand that ordinal means we can just make some preferences. We do not quantify the utility, we just make preferences. We prefer A to B or B to C, like this. And third assumption is that non-satiety, that is, more is always preferred to less. A consumer always prefer more of a commodity than the less one. The fourth assumption we make is that diminishing marginal rate of substitution. So we'll discuss it in a later mode in detail, but still we can just understand it in a nutshell. That is, while fixing the marginal rate of substitution, that is the rate of substituting a commodity good X for a good Y, this rate of substitution always diminishes as we have more of Y and less of X. Okay, and the fifth point is that consistency. We assume the consumer to be a consistent one. That is, if he prefers A to B and B to A, then none of the condition he prefers B to A. In no condition he will prefer B to A. If he prefers A to B, then he will always, in all conditions, he will prefer A to B. He will never tell that he prefers B to A again. Okay. The last assumption we take is of transitivity. That is, if a consumer prefers A to B and B to C, then automatically we can assume that the consumer prefers A to C. That is, he never prefers C to A again. Okay. So these are the assumptions. One thing we have to keep in mind, that these are the assumptions for the indifference curve analysis only. This is not the assumption of the indifference curve. We have some properties of indifference curve, again which we will discuss in later class in detail mode. Just we will go through the indifference curve assumptions, that is only the properties of the indifference curve in this class. So before going to that, in your slides you can see that we have to define the indifference curve. What is an indifference curve? Indifference curve is that curve which shows various combinations of goods and services, preferably goods, because we are discussing about goods here, or varieties of combinations of goods which gives same level of satisfaction to the consumer. That is why this indifference curve analysis is also named as iso-utility curve. All the points shown in the indifference curve gives equal amount of satisfaction, equal level of satisfaction to the consumer. Okay, so we can define it as an indifference curve is the locus of all those combinations of two goods which give the same level of satisfaction to the consumer. You will find out in the slides. Okay, moving on to the next slides, we can see that the properties of the indifference curve. So before going on to how indifference curve behaves, we have to understand what are the properties that indifference curve follows. Number one property is that an indifference curve has always got a negative slope. That is, the indifference curve slopes downward from left to right, always. Why? Because in indifference curve, the goods which we are considering, that is suppose x and y, the goods x and y always have their limited choices. We have minimum amount of, we have a constraint regarding the budget. We have a fixed budget, and within this budget, if we are considering to increase some amount of x, we have to sacrifice some amount of y also. That is why the indifference curve slopes downward from left to right. That is our first assumption. The second assumption is that indifference curve is always convex to the origin. Why? Because the marginal rate of substitution that we discussed earlier, that is the amount of x we want to sacrifice to have some more amount of y, this rate always gets decreased from left to right. That is why the indifference curve always is a convex to the origin. We have to say that indifference curve is convex to the origin. Third properties comes to our mind is that two indifference curve cannot intersect each other. Why? Because the one assumption of indifference curve is that the higher the indifference curve, it possesses higher level of utility. That you will find in your next property, that higher the indifference curve, higher will be the level of utility it possesses. That is why if two indifference curve intersects, then there arise a confusion regarding 2 or 3 points which lies in both of the indifference curve. Because if two indifference curve intersects, one point will be there which lies in both of the indifference curves. That is why two indifference curve cannot intersect each other. Fifth point we have to consider is that indifference curve cannot touches either of the axis. No indifference curve will, you can see in the slide, no indifference curve will touch either of the axis, either of x or y. Why? Because the consumer is rational one, and consumer always try to consume both of the commodity. He do not prefer a commodity, one of the commodity to be zero. That is why if the indifference curve touches one of the axis, then the commodity of that particular commodity that we are predicting, we are depicting in that particular axis becomes zero. That is why an indifference curve cannot touch either of the axis. Sixth property of the indifference curve is that no indifference curve is parallel to each other, because indifference curve need not to be parallel to each other, because in an indifference schedule, in each of the point in that indifference schedule, there lies innumerous numbers of indifference curves. So we do not consider that all indifference curves have to be parallel to each other. So these are the properties of the indifference curves, and few more properties of the indifference curve will be discussed in the later part of this class. So for today's class, you just have to remember these properties of the indifference curve and the assumptions that we take for the indifference curve analysis as a whole. In the whole part of indifference curve analysis, we discuss two things. One is indifference curve and another is the budget constraint, that is the budget line or budget equation, whatever name we may say. So for this, we will discuss the other properties of indifference curves and all the properties of the budget line, and also the equilibrium condition the consumer will derive from this indifference curve analysis in the later part of this class. For today's class, you just have to remember these properties and assumptions of the indifference curve analysis. Thank you. See you in the next class.